Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. Now we're coming to an episode that I've always enjoyed, but like a couple others, it's one that part of what they touch on does touch me a little bit more now that I'm older. Although I will say, from a subconscious standpoint, when I first saw the episode, it was a little bit, which I will get into as I discuss this subject matter. That, of course, is Driving Frank. Plot of this film is that it opens with Robert trying to get Frank because he's going to give him a ticket for backing into his patrol car. Frank, of course, being his usual stuff, trying to argue with it. Then he tells Robert that if he tries to come home that night, he's going to have him arrested for breaking and entering, which I'd have to really look at a lot of the law specifically, but Frank, I don't believe breaking and entering works that way, even in the state of New York in the 90s. Because from what I know of the law, technically, with how long he's lived there, he would be a tenant. Robert would be. Even if he doesn't pay rent directly, like Frank insinuates during season 2. But with how long he has lived there, in order to kick him out, Frank would have to go through eviction. And technically, while he's still there, he's still a tenant of the residence, so you can't be charged with breaking and entering. Could also be a difference in New York versus California law, but I have a feeling the laws would probably be slightly similar, but that's just me throwing that out there. I didn't take the time to actually research it because it's such a minor thing. At the same time, it could also be that maybe it is the case, because, I mean, Robert is like, but it could also be that he just doesn't want to press the point and all that, and you know how Frank is. I mean, they even discussed that a little bit, is that he's too aggressive, that's why I can't tell him. So Robert decides to give him a warning about it, but because of all this, and because of Frank's attitude, Debra's like, I don't want him driving the kids anymore. We see a first challenged on it when it becomes Happy Zone Day, which I don't think I've mentioned the Happy Zone yet, as they call it. That's the in-universe stand-in for places like Chuck E. Cheese, My Buddy's Pizza, other large places that have a lot of games and serve pizza. I say primarily Chuck E. Cheese, because, you know, you can't really use the trademark name unless you're gonna unless they're a sponsor, but that's a whole different thing. It's a lot easier just to make up your own. Well, Debra decides to interfere and goes into a whole convoluted thing of like, you're driving with them, you're driving with them. And they all end up at the Happy Zone. And after driving with Frank, Ray finally sees Debra's point of view because, as he puts it, he shouldn't be driving the kids. He shouldn't be driving at all. And what changed his mind? Frank cut off the hearse of a funeral procession, which I've actually been in part of a funeral procession before, so it makes me wonder, where was the motorcade cop with this? Shouldn't Frank have been pulled over and ticketed for that, and thus would have been found out earlier that he's not having a valid license, and then have him imprisoned, and then Ray go on with the car and go there, like, where's Frank? Oh, he's in jail. Then, meanwhile, when he's walking through, like, Robert would see, Dad, get me out of here! But no, that's not what happens. Instead, Frank just gets into a verbal altercation with the family, the mourners, after he cut off the hearse. And of course, he tries to call them idiots for all that, as Frank is apt to do. But it's like, you just cut off the hearse. Anybody would be mad at you. Because that's one thing you do not cut off. When you're driving, there's a few things you do not do. You do not just keep on driving when a emergency vehicle is going your way. You do not cut off a hearse. And you do not keep driving forward when someone else has the right of way. Those are just 3 things you don't do. And Frank is probably apt to do all of them. Also, you don't just roll on through a stop sign just because nobody's coming. Which, of course, is something Frank does later in the episode. They all force him to go get his license, and Ray goes with him. And as they're driving, we really see what type of driver Frank is up close and personal. Like, as he puts it, there's only one signal you need. And he flips someone the bird. Of course, can't really show this finger, so he does it like this. Like, there's only one signal you need. And despite what we think, Frank passes the test. Now, based on what we see in the scene that leads up to Ray coming back and telling Debra that Frank passed his driving test, I would assume that Frank adjusts how he's driving depending on who's in the vehicle with him. When it's his driving instructor, he's going to drive a lot more focused, a lot more by the book. And this just is from an observation of me observing people driving and also driving myself. You tend to drive a little differently when there's someone official in the vehicle with us. And of course, there's always a thing about driving a little differently when there's a cop in the vicinity. Like, don't want to give them any reason to pulled over. And in that case, Frank seems like he would pull that. And of course, Ray's all like, "Oh my God, I can't believe he passed." It's like, you forget he probably would do that. I mean, as he pointed out in the scene prior, he's like, "I taught you how to drive." But even with this, they decide they don't want him driving the kid still, even if he has his valid license, because he's just too aggressive and they don't trust him. Which it seems like is going to be a big argument, but in the next scene, Frank does relent a little bit. He's like, even if he's going to go with them, he's like, "All right, if you go with me, you can drive." Of course, he puts it off, as a joking, "I'll have both hands free for signaling." But I think it's also Frank seeing that, all right, I am a bit older, I can still drive and still see, but if they're going to come with me, I'll just let them drive so I can just have the fun part of the experience without having to do any of the work. As I mentioned in the intro, this is one that it touched me subconsciously when I was younger, but it's one that I do identify with a little bit more. Part of it is that now, since I actually drive, unlike the last time I remember watching this episode or the first time I saw it, I understand a little bit more about the importance of all the driving stuff. I mean, you don't have to drive to understand it, but when you have that first-hand experience, it hits you a little bit more. But also both of my grandparents, like the one that introduced me to the show, passed away right after Peter Boyle did. In her later years, she was very particular about where she drove. And of course, now my grandmother I live with, she rarely drives as much. Right now, it's because of a eye issue, but even before then, it's like rarely driving, and even then, it's particular places. So the whole thing about your driving habits changing as you get older, might not being the best idea for you to drive as you get older, hits me watching this episode because of that. It's like, yeah, it has a point, and then Ray and Debra talking about it, like, yeah, he probably should not be driving like this. Now you gotta go get that test just to make sure you can still drive. Definitely hits me a little bit more. It makes me also wonder when I get up into that age bracket, like, how I feel about it. Not being able to drive anymore, having to let others drive me, not being able to see properly to drive, because you can tell I already wear glasses, so when I get up there in age, I'll probably have either thicker pair, or it might be like my grandmother, where I'm both near and farsighted because my eyes start to degenerate, which is the degradation of old age, as it were. It's one of those things that nags at me as I'm watching this, but it's balanced pretty well with the humor, and I think that comes down to Cindy Chupak's writing. She's written some other episodes, Working Late Again, The Getaway, and Working Girl from later in this season, so it's a name we'll hear again. But she also wrote episodes of Modern Family and Sex and the City, so she does understand character work. And the episodes she does here usually involve the character interactions, but a lot of the episodes do, but they're usually specific ones. This one, it's all the people's relationship with Frank. Getaway, it's going to be Debra and Ray. And Working Girl, it's going to be Debra, a little bit with her family, but her own self-worth, which is always interesting in this show when they have the characters look at themselves and try to better themselves. In the later seasons, before Robert actually does marry Amy, we're going to see a lot of that, for better and for worse. One possibility about this episode is that the beginning part of it takes place in between the bulk of the previous episode and the coda where Frank finds his remote in Robert's room, which was set there by Ray. I didn't mention it in my review of that episode, but Debra, one of her pettiness is she takes the remote upstairs to hide it from Frank. Frank goes crazy looking for the remote, and Ray decides to hold on to it and then plant it at the right moment, and he decides his revenge to plant it in Robert's room. And that episode ends with Robert going into his room, the door opening, Frank's behind it, he holds up the remote like, "You." Now, he mentions it in passing that he found the remote after he had to get the keys back from Marie, because she took the keys and did it like that. Now, this could be a separate incident where he lost the remote, where Marie was hiding it from him just as revenge, and then he found it in turn when he got his keys. Or it could be that in the course of that night, for some weird reason, he had to go into Robert's room, which, of course, Marie and Frank, they tend to be those type of parents who would just barge into the room even though they can't. But he probably found it in there, and then that scene happened. It's never explained other than the throwaway gag. So it could be either. It's up to you. Overall, Driving Frank is a pretty fun episode. That central conflict anyone can identify with, but I think it hits you more after you get over a certain age. Probably once you do hit a certain age, it probably is like Peter Boyle. He plays off everything well. Everyone confronting him, the writing. I don't know yet if I would put this in the top 5 of the season, but it would definitely be in the running. And it's always been one that I always watch. Now, the following episode is one that I cannot say the same of, and it's one I usually find myself skipping unless I'm marathoning the entire show like I am for the course of these videos. And that, of course, is The Sitter. But there is going to be a few firsts about it that I'll be able to talk about. But we'll see. Might be like Fascinating Debra, where it's one I watch now where I'm older. I'm like, you know what? This episode isn't as or as skippable as I remember.